Greetings, fellow mortals. I'm not gonna sit here and say that I'm the biggest fan of the MCU at this point. Once Endgame came out and finished most of the storylines, I kind of fell off the Marvel stuff. WandaVision had an interesting concept but was executed somewhat sloppily. Falcon and Winter Soldier didn't really stand out much. Black Widow proved to be a movie that didn't matter in the grand scheme of things. Loki stumbled around like it had been binge drinking for days, and Moon Knight was just okay, but I think it could have been a little bit better. Oh, and then there was the Hawkeye show. I literally forget what happens in that one. I did like the Spider-Man movies, not that I'd side with Sony movies on about anything, and Multiverse of Madness was a good time too. Even with those, it feels like the MCU is continuing past where the story should have ended. There isn't the same spark as before. Maybe the universe needed a few years to breathe, let the creative juices flow a bit more. But who am I to judge when Disney is making absurd amounts of money on this stuff? People obviously want more from this franchise. I'm not the type of person to get in the way of things that people enjoy. I just wish that those things could be a little bit more interesting after everything that came before it. Take Miss Marvel, for example. Now that's an interesting character that writers could craft unique stories around. At least, they should be able to. I mean, the premise sounds amazing to me. A young girl from a religious fundamentalist family gains superpowers and tries to help people while respecting the teachings of her fundamental religion. Add in the interesting side of the teenage girl dealing with bullying in high school angle, and Kamala Khan could be one of the most interesting comic book characters introduced in a long time. Emphasis on could be. I found that the practices behind Miss Marvel in the comics, the Avengers video game, and the TV show let down the character a lot. It feels like they're keeping her from reaching her potential as one of the most popular comic book characters of all time. Perhaps it's merely the difference in the type of story that the writers were trying to create. Oftentimes, the sitcom tendencies of the comic books made me think that Miss Marvel was like a Disney Channel show. It made me categorize Miss Marvel as an attempt to get a female demographic to read the comic books. But then I saw that they were trying to do storylines about discrimination against people who follow the Muslim faith. So it left me rather confused. Was Miss Marvel a look at real issues or a wacky series filled with rainbows and unicorns? Either one is fine, but they didn't exactly mix well. Or at least, the writing didn't mix them very well. If they used Miss Marvel's dual identity as a way to separate the ideas, then it could have worked a little bit better. Show that Kamala Khan is happier when she's free to work as Miss Marvel but struggles more in everyday life. Or vice versa. Either one could work. Of course, I'm not an expert on comic books or anything. Usually I only pick up one every couple of months to see what's going on. I think that these weird tone shifts that I see every time are one of the problems that keep Miss Marvel from jumping up in popularity. She, like a lot of the modern Marvel characters, can go from wacky teenage antics that have been scrubbed as clean as can be to talks about racial and gender discrimination in the blink of an eye. And there are long texts about the smaller details of it too. Then they go right back to the wacky nonsense. It's a strong sense of whiplash. There's a reason that the genres are separated a lot. There are comedies that can address real issues, but they don't tend to follow teenagers who act like they've never heard of drugs, sex, or issues that exist outside of the United States. Speaking of the other new characters, I think that the attempts to use old popular characters as jumping off points for the new characters hasn't exactly worked out well. It's left the new characters without their own sense of identity. They're constantly being compared to their old characters. Even the Miles Morales Spider-Man has to exist next to the Peter Parker Spider-Man. One of them needs to change their name. It could be Peter for all I care, but something needs to change, especially with the next Spider-Man video game coming out. Like Miles, all of the new characters need a jumping off point to become their own people. This isn't exactly anything new for comic book characters. Take Jason Todd, for example. He replaced Richard Grayson as Robin, but no one really liked him. It got to the point where fans actually voted for Jason to die. That led to the Joker killing him, and then he was left dead for years. He was later resurrected by one of Batman's enemies and then took on the identity of the Red Hood. The writers used his bratty personality as a jumping off point into something more unhinged and interesting. He became more of a brutal vigilante, a lot like the Punisher. That's not to say that there wasn't a few storyline hiccups, but fans do seem to like him more now as the Red Hood compared to Robin. That isn't to say that I think that they should just kill off Miss Marvel. Of course not. That's a terrible idea. You could just give her a new name, because the fact that she holds a similar title to other already established characters does make it harder for fans to get attached to her. There were a few times when I had friends come to me and say that they thought Disney was making a show about Captain Marvel instead of Kamala Khan. They were pretty confused. It doesn't even have to be that original of a name change. It could be just something like having Marvelous be in the title. Rebranding can help her stand out a lot more. Of course, too much rebranding is another problem on its own. Rebooting in alternate universes is something that has become rather prevalent for comic book characters. Two of the biggest examples are Batman and Spider-Man. They both had different comic books, TV shows, movies, and video games. The difference is that those characters have almost a century's worth of history behind them. Even with the different tones, characteristics, and storylines, they both have consistent backstories, personalities, and abilities throughout the different media. The same can't be said for Kamala Khan, despite the fact that she doesn't even have a decade of existence yet. It's hard to say what Miss Marvel's complete personality is even like. Let's forget about the comic book industry with this example. That medium does have a tendency of changing their characters over time anyway. Black Widow and Hawkeye originally started out as generic villains, and they changed over time to become what we know now. Unfortunately, Kamala doesn't have this slow process to help her. She has different versions of herself in different forms of media over a very short period of time. Her entire backstory was altered in the Avengers video game, and then the game was flushed down the toilet by the companies behind it when they flooded the game with microtransactions, meaning that people who bought the full price game had to pay more for gambling elements. Yeah, it wasn't exactly a good first outing for Miss Marvel when it comes to video games. I don't think that anyone could argue that they did her character justice with that kind of behavior. In comparison to the video game, the Disney Plus show is a lot less morally disgusting. It comes off as a teenage girl show, and that's fine. As a grown man, I know that the show just simply isn't for me. I hope that young girls enjoy it. In fact, I hope that it makes them a fan of Kamala Khan. The problem is that they fundamentally changed her powers. Instead of gaining the elastic-like abilities of Mr. Fantastic, she gained more energy manipulation closer to Captain Marvel. Now, I don't care about the reason that the showrunners gave. They can do what they want, but it does create an inconsistency between all of her other appearances. I do think that making these changes in rapid succession is going to make it harder for fans to stay invested in Miss Marvel. Will Kamala's powers change in the comics now? What about in the video games? Will every other form of Kamala change to match the show? Will this be a completely different version? Which one is the real version? Perhaps it would be better if they just stick to one version for consistency. People, fans especially, don't like rapid change. At this point, you might be asking where I'm going with this. I readily admit that Kamala Khan isn't marketed to me. Why should I care? Do I hate women? Am I Islamophobic? Well, I don't want to change those aspects of her. In fact, I think those are the aspects of her that would make her a more fun character to write. Because I think that Miss Marvel could be one of the most interesting ideas to come out of comic books in years. The problem is that the writing and the company decisions aren't behind her in the right way, other than to make content for content's sake. Just think about it for a second. A girl tried to be a superhero while trying to follow the fundamentals of her religion. There's a splash of Daredevil. A family that disapproves of Miss Marvel for her flamboyance and her powers. That's a dash of X-Men. There could be high school problems where Kamala has to hear girls be passive-aggressive about her religion and skin color. All the while, they mock Miss Marvel's powers for making her body look gross when she's stretching. Then she could have the dating problems because of all the comments that she hears from the perverse teenage boys who talk about her alter ego and her powers. It's like a female Spider-Man. There are so many different elements that could work. But it feels like all the problems are getting in the way. Inconsistent tone in the writing, lack of an original identity, constant rebranding. It just gets in the way. It's a lot of baggage, but I feel that the interesting concepts behind the character pull her forward more than a lot of the other newer characters. Even more than America Chavez, and America Chavez just appeared in Multiverse of Madness. Just one good run for Kamala Khan could be the thing that makes her jump into new heights of popularity. In fact, it could be what the show does. Because I want to experience interesting stories about different perspectives. I want to hear what a female superhero would go through. I want to hear the struggles of a Muslim superhero. Those demographics deserve developed characters. And memorable stories are about those characters. How these characters grow and change the world around them. Kamala Khan still hasn't found her footing yet. When she does, and she gets some good stories under her belt, she could be iconic. Let's just hope that the corporate interference doesn't keep getting in the way. Because even if something isn't my cup of tea, I still want it to succeed and to be the best version of itself possible. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoy my takes on storytelling, please remember that I will be self-publishing my novel, Dance of Frozen Death, at the beginning of 2023. I hope that you check it out. I appreciate you. Do not despair.